Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last General Secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union and the last Soviet leader, died on Tuesday, the 30th of August. His passing comes at a tumultuous time in Russian history, when the current Russian leadership under Putin hopes to overturn the very ideas that Gorbachev had introduced 3 decades earlier. After his death, soon enough, a commercial he had shot for Pizza Hut went viral on Twitter. And what an interesting way to pay tribute to this man, Gorbachev. As many of you might recall, Gorbachev, as the president of the Soviet Union, instituted the policies of Glasnost and Perestroika, which enabled democratization and liberalization in the Soviet Union. And this eventually led to its disintegration. The fall of Soviet Union led to independence of many Eastern European countries, brought upon the effective end of the Cold War and the emergence of a unipolar world order under the United States of America. While in power, Gorbachev was also a key figure in the worldwide negotiations on nuclear disarmament and reduction of nuclear weapons worldwide. And this is something we will be focusing our discussion today. Hi, I'm Shirikrishna Upadhyaya, and in this episode, we will be discussing Gorbachev's relentless effort as a world leader to rid the world of existential dangers. And joining me to talk about Gorbachev and his nuclear legacy is Pranav Satyanath, my colleague from Takshashila. Welcome, Pranav.
Hey, Shri Krishna.
So, Pranav, why don't you start talking about Mikhail Gorbachev, the man himself? What makes him such a legendary yet controversial figure? And what do you think gave rise to a leader like Gorbachev in the Soviet system?
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to start to introduce Gorbachev. I think many of our listeners, almost all our listeners will know from school days and maybe college days that Gorbachev was the last General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, he was also the first president of the Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union did not have a president for a long time. He was the first president of the Soviet Union, and that was quite something. The rise of Gorbachev is quite interesting. Gorbachev is one of the most unlikely candidates to become a leader, right? He was one of the youngest leaders in the Soviet Union because after Stalin's death, we had Leonid Brezhnev, who ruled for a very long time. And after Brezhnev's death, you had a number of leaders who came and they passed away quite quickly, right? There was a joke in the Soviet Union that no leader would survive beyond 2 years. And the conditions that, because almost all these leaders were dying, gave rise to Gorbachev because he was young, he was energetic. It wasn't like any other normal leader who was much older and old guard. But Gorbachev is not a part of the old guard. A lot of people would say that he was a part of the old guard. He was new, but in fact, his times go back to the 1950s when he started off in Sevastopol, in the youth brigade of the Communist Party, and then he slowly rose up the ranks in the Sevastopol region, finally becoming the secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party in 1978. His inspiration, of course, was Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev, after the death of Stalin, was a very controversial figure. By all means, he was a controversial figure. But he was also an individual who sincerely wanted to craft a good relationship with the United States, right? After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev took many steps to ensure that the US and the Soviet Union would not get into a nuclear brink, which involved compensating many of the Soviet positions. The partial test ban treaty that was signed in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the first step in which the US and the Soviet Union agreed to take some limits on their nuclear testing. And this was the first cut of what was to become his ultimate demise. The Soviet Union's leadership did not take it kindly that you would have a leader compensating Soviet security, and ultimately he was axed, and Leonid Brezhnev came to the leadership. Gorbachev was certainly inspired by Khrushchev because Khrushchev had many revolutionary ideas. He took down the Stalinist ideas, even though it was in some way hypocritical. Khrushchev was responsible for bringing down the bloodshed or reducing the bloodshed that was a part and parcel of the Stalin regime. And Gorbachev certainly got inspired by this, and which is what made him, which is what shaped his career in the later years. So, as I said, he became the secretary of the Central Committee. The Central Committee is one of the most powerful institutions within the Soviet Communist Party. And after Brezhnev died in 1982, Yuri Andropov took over. And Yuri Andropov took over from the end of 1982, and he died just a few months later in February 1984. After that, you had Konstantin Chernenko, who was leader between 1984 and 1985, survived for a year. And Chernenko gave way in 1985 to Gorbachev. And by this time, the Soviet Union was in the brink of a losing war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan by 1985 itself did not look like did not look very great for the Soviet Union, as they were having mounting losses through the Mujahideen. And Gorbachev really wanted to change the image of the Soviet Union and eventually introduce the ideas of perestroika and glasnost, quite the legacy of his domestic reforms. So ultimately, I would say that what gave rise to Gorbachev was circumstance. If the old guard had stayed, if these leaders were to be alive for much longer, we might have never seen the rise of Gorbachev. And we might not have seen, him take down several of the old systems that were put in place during the Brezhnev era. So it's pure circumstance, and it was this idea that Gorbachev had that the Soviet Union genuinely needed to change itself if it wanted to avoid downfall. That's what gave rise to Gorbachev.
That's actually interesting, because we have imagined Soviet Union to be we've always thought of it as a one-party state where there is rule by diktat, and there is so much centralization and concentration of power. But within this system, we saw a man like Gorbachev with a very different set of ideas than his predecessors emerge, and he eventually was able to gain power. He was able to put himself in the topmost seat of the Soviet Union, and from there he could direct Soviet policy. But his legacy is contested as within Russia and outside as well. But anyway, let's segue into our topic of our theme of our discussion today, which is basically a nuclear arms race, right? And Gorbachev played a crucial role, is what I understand. So I would like to know from you, within the setting of Cold War, where nuclear arms race between the great powers was very, very crucial to Cold War, and states diverted a lot of political, military, and economic energy towards winning the nuclear war. So in this sort of scenario, how was Gorbachev different, and how did he sort of contribute to nuclear arms control on planet Earth today?
Yeah, thanks for that. And just to begin answering this question, Mikhail Gorbachev is viewed as a very, very the leader who was almost like the sole person responsible for this revolution in the way the Soviet Union thought about arms control. And that's true. On the Soviet side, that's true. But I think in my answer, what I also want to highlight is that it was not only Gorbachev. Gorbachev was only one part of the story. There was also the American part of the story that people often forget. And Ronald Reagan, who was Gorbachev's counterpart, is often undermined in these stories. So I think eventually, as I answer this question, I would like to highlight both sides of the coin and talk about how two leaders actually made up the golden age of arms control. But to begin with, let's give a context to where the Soviet Union and the US were during the Cold War on arms control. As I mentioned, firstly, just after the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, the partial test ban treaty was agreed upon, and it entered into force. I think eventually after the partial test ban treaty, the US and the Soviet Union had realized that some controls were needed to avoid accidents, to avoid a costly arms race, or to take the arms competition in a direction that would have really undermined strategic stability. Strategic stability here is that no one side has the dominant power to win a nuclear war. So in this context, they signed the Hotline Agreement, and then the cornerstone of arms control was signed in 1972 when US and Soviet Union signed the ABM Treaty and SALT I Interim Agreement. SALT I is the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which was initiated in 1969. First, it was initiated under Lyndon Johnson and eventually taken up by Nixon. And during this era was when US and Soviet cooperation went to its peak, including the role of the US National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the Soviet ambassador to the United States. And so the Soviet ambassador to the United States played a very important role, and he was actually had more power than most Soviet leaders. Anatoly Dobrynin was a long-time ambassador to the United States of the Soviet Union, and Anatoly Dobrynin and Henry Kissinger and others in the U.S. administration were able to build a very cordial relationship, which gave rise to the SALT I agreement. And then after SALT I when the Carter administration came into power, Jimmy Carter had even greater ideas about where to take arms control forward, and this was when SALT II agreement was crafted with greater reductions and control on technologies such as multiple re-entry vehicles, or what we call MIRVs, multiple independent re-entry vehicles. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union took a very bad action and invaded Afghanistan in 1979. This coincided with the time when the United States had to ratify the SALT II agreement in Congress. It was ultimately slashed because Jimmy Carter looked almost naive that he trusted the Soviet Union. The attitude in the US was the Soviet Union could never be trusted, and SALT II eventually was axed because it was never ratified. This was also the time when the US and Soviet Union did not agree on more intrusive verification measures for arms control. What we talk about, what we call on-site inspections, that is, both sides taking inspectors to each other's nuclear facilities and ensuring that the number of missiles or the number of warheads are within the treaty limits. The Soviet Union leadership were absolutely against any form of on-site inspections. The US were, in fact, against this too, but they were just free riding on the Soviet narrative. So we shouldn't think that the Americans were somehow inspired by great ideas. The Americans themselves were against on-site inspections, but they hid their agenda because the Soviets were jumping the gun first. And when Ronald Reagan came in 1981, Ronald Reagan wanted to negotiate arms control. There is a myth that Ronald Reagan did not want to negotiate arms control, but Ronald Reagan did want to negotiate arms control, and he started a fresh idea called Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty. So the START talks, as it's called, began in 1981 when Leonid Brezhnev was still the leader, and the US and the US started negotiating on two tracks. First was the arms reduction on strategic missiles, and other was intermediate range missiles, that is missiles in Europe and missiles in Soviet Union which were within the range of Europe. So two tracks were formed, but then Reagan adopted this policy called as the dual track policy, where on one hand the US was placing intermediate range missiles in this in Europe while they were trying to negotiate limits. This did not go well with the Soviet Union, and in 1983, the Soviet Union, by the end of 1983, the Soviet Union walked out of the negotiations. And just to understand how arms control policy was formed in the Soviet Union, there was a group of 5 leaders. They're called as the Big Five leaders. When the negotiations of SALT II began, this group really took a solid formation, which include Dmitry Ustinov, Andrei Grechko, Andrei Gromyko, Yuri Andropov, and Leonid Smirnov. I will not explain the role of each of these leaders because that will take us to an entirely different tangent. But what's important to know that this was the old guard of the Soviet Union, very close to the Soviet military, and their interest was always in line with the Soviet military, who always wanted to ensure that the Soviet Union had the match with the United States, both technologically and numerically. They want to match the United States and sometimes exceed the number of nuclear weapons that they had, right? And when Gorbachev came, he realized that this was an excess, and Gorbachev really shook the leadership and brought in a younger technocracy. While the military still retained a lot of power, while they were a part of the negotiations, a lot of negotiations began to be handled by a younger set of negotiators and academics who had a lot more exposure to Western ideas. So that's the one story. That is, in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev came, overturned the Big Five, and it became a new way of thinking about arms control, where the Soviet Union was finally okay with having on-site inspections. On the American side, Ronald Reagan had this new idea, which was almost antithetical to almost any nuclear arms control theory or deterrence theory. he had this idea that we would have these highly advanced weapons in space and on ground that could defend against missiles. And missiles would be rendered obsolete because you would have the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was announced in 1983. So Ronald Reagan, in a very strange manner, became a proponent of disarmament, but also became a staunch advocate for advanced missile defenses. And this strange phenomenon where Gorbachev wanted to reduce the burden on the Soviet economy by slashing nuclear weapons. And on the other hand, you have a strange obsession with disarmament while advocating for strategic defenses on the American side, gave rise to this friendship between Reagan and Gorbachev, which ultimately led to arms control. During the Reykjavik summit in 1985, they almost came into agreement for reducing nuclear weapons in a very, very steep way. They wanted to have very, very deep cuts in one day of negotiations. Now, October 11th and October 12th of 1986, they couldn't agree upon it because Reagan stuck to his guns and he said he will not let go of the Strategic Defense Initiative. So ultimately, we did not get deep reductions, but what we got was the INF treaty, where the Soviet Union was able to compensate on missiles, the zero option. And ultimately, the legacy of Gorbachev went to Boris Yeltsin and George H.W. Bush, who signed the START 1 agreement, which took almost 9 years to negotiate, or 10 years to negotiate. Yeah, that's the long answer, but it's a gist in the complex history of arms control.
Sure. Thank you, Pranav. So we'll take a short break and we'll soon be back with more specifics about these treaties that Pranav just spoke about. Welcome back. I'm Shirikrishna and I have Pranav with me, and we are discussing nuclear arms race, nuclear arms control, and nuclear disarmament from the perspective of the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev, who passed away last week. So, Pranav, you mentioned a couple of treaties which I believe were significant from the era of Gorbachev, first with Reagan Gorbachev, and then Bush Gorbachev. These were the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty from 1987. And the second one was Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which was signed by Bush and Gorbachev. So could you get into more specifics? So what were these treaties really about? And what eventually led to their negotiation? What were the bargaining positions adopted by both sides? And what ultimately led to the signing? And finally, could you also talk about how these two treaties have been implemented? Because I know that US has withdrawn from INF Treaty, I think during Trump's presidency. And the START Treaty is set to see another round of negotiation very soon. So the floor is yours. Do tell us about these treaties and their fate today.
Yeah, I think I gave up most of the details of these two treaties in my previous answer. I laid down what the premise was. So the big five in the Soviet arms control negotiations had a position where they wanted to ensure that the Soviet Union preserved an advantage, or at least a match with the United States. By 1980s, when Reagan had come, they realized that qualitatively and technology-wise, they just could not match the US. And they just wanted to preserve the numbers. The numbers became very important. But at the same time, they also realized that Soviet Union knew that they needed arms control to control some of the American capabilities. But what they were not ready to give up on was things like on-site inspections, because they were sincerely worried that the US would be able to gather far more information about Soviet capabilities and use it for a nuclear attack. And this idea stuck for quite a long time. The Reagan administration pursued a dual-track policy with the INF Treaty when they started deploying ground-based cruise missiles, or GLICM, ground-launched cruise missiles in the UK, in the UK and in the and in Europe. This almost destroyed the European alliance. I won't get into the history of it, but it almost destroyed the European alliance because Europe was definitely worried that having nuclear weapons on their land would make them prime targets, because the Soviet Union would firstly go and attack whatever missiles were there in Europe. So this almost broke the alliance. But Ronald Reagan wanted this position because he wanted to force the Soviet Union to negotiate a zero option. That is, both sides would have zero number of intermediate range and shorter range missiles in Europe and in Soviet Union. The Soviet Union walked out because they genuinely felt threatened. They felt that the Americans were negotiating in bad faith. When Gorbachev came in 1985, Gorbachev really wanted to kickstart these negotiations. So when negotiations were cut short in November 1983, as soon as Gorbachev entered, negotiations kickstarted on the INF, and very quickly the Soviet Union was open to the idea of on-site inspections. They wanted American inspectors to come and ensure that there are zero missiles, because Gorbachev and team understood that you cannot have an effective treaty without measures that can ensure that there are zero missiles on both sides. The Americans were initially taken aback because the Americans themselves did not want on-site inspections. But eventually, both sides were able to work together. And in 1987, they signed the INF Treaty. And in December 1987, the INF Treaty was signed. And this laid the ground for the SALT I agreement, the START I agreement, my apologies. The START I agreement was a very, very complex agreement because it had several layers of limits. That you could have limits on strategic long-range missiles, missiles that were categorized as heavy missiles, because the Soviet Union had a type of missiles that would carry almost 10 nuclear warheads. And there were several layers. And the lessons learned from the INF Treaty genuinely helped take forward. And the most productive years were 1987 to 1990, when a lot of the groundwork was laid down and limits were able to be accepted. And from the lessons on on-site inspections was all transferred to the SALT I Treaty, to this START I Treaty. And once the START I Treaty was signed, and the Soviet Union had fallen by the time START I was in its final leg of negotiations, and START I became a lot easier to negotiate because the Soviet Union were in desperation to cut the number of nuclear weapons they had, because they wanted to save their economy, which was in the brink of collapse. So that's the gist of it. I did not go into more details, but that's the details that I can provide in a short episode.
Thanks, Pranav. So I'm actually quite interested in the future of arms control now, because we saw the heydays of arms control during that era of end of Cold War, and then we had the US sort of assuming the numero uno position in the world. And however, that is under threat today. Things are changing. The Russia-Ukraine crisis has opened up a lot of fault lines. A lot of people believe that US itself is in decline. So in this sort of a different emerging global order, what do you think is the future for arms control? And if at all we can draw some lessons from this Gorbachev-Reagan era, what would those lessons for arms control be?
I think the very short answer to that would be leadership matters. When studying international politics and international relations, a lot of times we tend to undermine the leaders who drive international politics. And the Reagan-Gorbachev era of arms control shows that leadership definitely matters. If you did not have revolutionary or evolutionary leaders, out of this world leaders like Gorbachev and Reagan, we would not have had agreements. It's very, very strange. Reagan was this kind of leader who was a Republican, who was for American power, American strength. But at the same time, he had this strange idea that nuclear weapons were obsolete because technology would give the way to destroy nuclear weapons when they were launched. He thought that Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, as it was mocked, would be the answer. And no sane leader, because Reagan did not come from, the traditional echelons of leadership. Even though he was the governor of California, he was not a politician. He was an actor, and he was influenced by a lot of entertainment around him. So when he watched movies about nuclear war, he was genuinely disturbed, and he wanted to do something with technology. And Gorbachev came from an era where he witnessed how so inefficient the Soviet economy had become, because it had lended itself to an arms buildup. You don't get such leadership today. When President Biden and President Putin met in early 2021, there was this excitement. They met in Reykjavik. There was this excitement that this was going to be a Gorbachev era, because there was a bilateral bilateral statement made which said that which reiterated what is known as the Gorbachev Reagan principles, that nuclear war cannot be won and must and never be fought. And my disdain with that was that you can make statements, you can definitely make statements saying nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. But if those statements are made by leaders who don't carry those essential ideas of disarmament or arms control or genuine perseverance to reduce nuclear risks, these statements are meaningless. And it's been proven to be meaningless when Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. So leadership matters. One lesson I would take away is that leadership definitely matters. Great ideas come because leaders emerge from circumstances and they have the impetus to implement revolutionary ideas. If not, you are going to have the status quo that's going to perpetuate. And the existing picture of arms control doesn't look good because Joseph Biden is not a leader who has revolutionary ideas. Joseph Biden is a part of the American old guard who's been very important for American nuclear policy, but his ideas are not revolutionary. Similarly, Vladimir Putin is by far not Gorbachev. He is the antithesis of Gorbachev, whether people like this idea or not. So the picture that I've painted for arms control is very bleak. There is, as of this moment, there isn't many positive things to say about the future of arms control. Yeah, but that's the pessimistic ending for this podcast, I believe.
Yeah, however unfortunate that sounds, but as you said, leadership does matter and things are constantly in flux. So we do hope like circumstances give rise to more leaders like Gorbachev himself. And although, like we discussed at the beginning, Mikhail Gorbachev has a very contested legacy, both in Russia, the ex-Soviet Union states, as well as in other countries in the world. But his contribution to nuclear disarmament and reduction in the global arms race does stand out, and we must credit him for that. And like you said, we do hope that circumstances turn out more such tall leaders who take a good stance when it comes to nuclear race and probably save this world from a nuclear catastrophe. Thank you, Pranav, for joining this episode of All Things Policy, and it was I'm happy to have hosted you here.
Yeah, thank you, Shirikrishna.
Thank you to our listeners. Stay tuned for another episode of All Things Policy. Thank you.